and welcome to Inside View. My name's Cory Burnell, and I'll be your host this episode. And we're welcoming and honored to be joined today by our Congressman, Tom McClintock, who's on recess from Washington. Welcome very much, Congressman.
Oh, thank you, Cory. It's great to be back.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic to have you here, and I know that our viewers are going to be very interested to hear what you have to say on a number of topics, as it's been obviously a very interesting session so far, and so much has changed.
You know, there's a Chinese curse, they say, may you live in interesting times.
And we certainly do, and we thank you for being on the front lines there, battling for us in these interesting times.
It is an honor. It is a privilege. Can't say it's always a pleasure, but it often is.
Well, very good. Well, obviously there are some hot topics that are being discussed as voters have high hopes for what might be done in these next 2 years here. So let's just kind of start right off the bat here with health care and the repeal of Obamacare. Let's get kind of an overall feeling from you on where you think that's at and where that's going, and then perhaps I can dive into some specifics.
Well, I think it's obvious to everybody where Obamacare is going. It's collapsing. Last year, in one-third of American counties, you had no choice of health providers. You had one provider in the Obamacare exchanges, and that's it. This year, that figure's grown to about 45%. And we're now seeing increasingly regions of the country where you cannot get provider at all. There are no policies available because no providers are willing to enter that market. That is becoming a crisis. At the same time, we've seen premiums go off the charts. Nationally, the average increase was 25% this year. We're warned it could be as high as 40%. In some areas, for example, next door in Arizona, we're seeing triple-digit percentage increases in premiums. It's basically pricing people out of the market. And a lot of this goes back to this one-size-fits-all mandate that Obamacare imposes on every American with a mandate to purchase insurance they may not want, may not need, and certainly can't afford. So we have a mandate. It's been registered now in the last 4 national elections to rescue our health care system and replace it with a healthy, vibrant, competitive market where people will have the freedom to make the choice of the widest range of policies, shop across state lines. If you can find a better policy in another state, you ought to be able to buy that policy. You can do that with any other kind of insurance. And then to have a supportive tax system so that these policies are within the reach of every family.
You know, you raise a phenomenally interesting issue that there are areas of the country where people can't even buy a policy that essentially conforms.
There's an old Soviet-era saying, what good is a free bus ticket in a city with no buses?
Right. Yeah.
And that's our healthcare system today, is increasingly so. And again, years ago, Will and Ariel Duran asked the question, what makes Ford a good car? Chevrolet, competition. That's exactly what we've taken out of the healthcare markets, and that's what the Republican plan is seeking to restore.
So if there are portions of the country where somebody can't actually even buy a policy, how can they conform to the mandate?
Well, they can't.
Right.
And in fact, it shouldn't surprise us that more people are either paying the stiff tax penalty or claiming a hardship exemption than are actually purchasing policies in the Obamacare exchanges. So people with their own decisions are telling us this system is not working. They would prefer to pay a stiff tax penalty than to buy an Obamacare plan.
Right. Now, it looks, from the outside looking in, it looks as if some of the gridlock with the Republican Party or the inability to kind of come to a consensus on a replacement package seems to surround one of the components of Obamacare, which was the coverage of pre-existing conditions. And so is it the case that there are some Republican legislators who simply are not willing to face the media scrutiny of this entitlement somehow being considered removed, the media
first of all,
the
plan that left the House of Representatives fully protects pre-existing conditions. The whole idea is to move those out of the premium base and into the same kind of assigned risk pools that we use for things like auto insurance and that work very well. They've been tried in other states like Maine and found to work very well. That brings the premiums down dramatically because you're no longer forcing people to, for example, example, forcing a teetotaler to purchase substance abuse coverage, or charging an older couple for full pediatric care. So that's already in the plan. The fundamental problem involves the Senate and the refusal by Senate Republicans to reform their cloture rule. The reason we got wrapped around in the around the access with health care was the fact that the House was trying to conform to the Senate cloture threshold, which is 60 votes. Well, there aren't 60 votes for Obamacare reform in the Senate right now. There's certainly a majority for them. So instead of sending a comprehensive bill that cleanly and completely repealed Obamacare and replaced it with all of the free market reforms that Republicans have agreed on and have campaigned on these last 4 national elections, instead of doing all of that, we tried to reform Obamacare through a budget process called reconciliation that gets around the Senate 60-vote rule. Well, the problem is you can't repeal Obamacare through budget reconciliation. You can only repeal certain parts of it. You cannot replace it as a whole. You can only replace certain parts of it. So we ended up with this tangled, mangled mess of a bill that got bad CBO numbers and ultimately couldn't even form a simple majority consensus in the Senate. That's the fundamental problem. 2 weeks after the election, I went to the House floor and I said that the biggest single obstacle toward enacting the reforms that the American people have expressed their desire to see over these last 4 elections is the Senate Republicans' refusal to reform their cloture rule. Cloture is the vote by which debate is concluded, and it stems from a very important parliamentary principle, and that is if a significant majority wants to continue a debate, that debate ought to continue. That's the whole essence of deliberation. The reason for the minority is to try to convince the majority to its point of view, or at least to point out flaws in the majority's thinking. So that's a very important rule, but it assumes it's a real debate. And it assumes that the debate is germane to the subject at hand and not people just reading out of the phone directory. The problem is, over the past 30 years, the cloture, actually 40 years now, the cloture rule has become not a matter of closing debate. It's required to start a debate. Instead of an actual debate among members, all a senator now has to do is file a protest at the desk, and that bill stops dead in its tracks. So we have the irony of a process that was originally designed to protect debate is now a very effective tool to prevent debate. And the sad fact is Senate Republicans have chosen not to reform this rule. It's not some act of God. It's not imposed upon them by the Constitution. This is a choice that Senate Republicans are making and need to be held accountable for. Now, I believe if we had sent a comprehensive health bill over to the Senate that did everything we talked about these past 8 years now, 2 things would have happened. Either 8 vulnerable Democrats who would be seen as the sole people standing in the way of health care reform would have crossed party lines and joined the Republicans, or the Senate Republicans would have concluded they need to reform their cloture rule for legislation, just as they've already done it for the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. So it's not as if this is something that's written in stone. They've already changed it for the Supreme Court. They need to change it for legislation, and particularly major legislation like this.
Well, you recently, this summer, wrote a column on the subject of this cloture rule in the Senate, and this dysfunction kind of gave people a little bit of an idea of its history and how it's doing just what you've laid out here on the show. So I would encourage our viewers to go ahead and Google that column.
Thank you. I think you can get it through Hillsdale College. It was actually a presentation I made there back in January. It was carried by their Imprimis publication. And if you don't subscribe to it, you should. It's a wonderful publication. Comes out once a month.
Excellent. Well, yeah, this adds to the frustration we have as voters that we send people to Washington to get something done and then watch Washington even mess up something as simple as their own rules in the Senate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we see that as a tremendous stumbling block. And then also this notion that the media labels this a nuclear option. as if there was something terrible would be done if you were to modify or amend or close debate on a subject. So very frustrating for us, obviously, on the outside looking in. So thankful that you have raised the specter here on that this is
and by the way, there are
troublesome.
ways they can reform it while preserving its original purpose, and that is to assure that the minority has the full access to debate an issue. This is a problem that's come up only over the past 40 years or so, since the 1970s, and it stems from changes that were made in the rule back then.
Now, you mentioned the House has generated a comprehensive bill that has passed the House, I presume, and is going to the Senate.
No,
that
again,
is a repeal. Or,
Again, it was not a comprehensive bill.
Not.
That was the whole
and that's
problem.
why you went through reconciliation
It
process.
was this, again, this partial, mangled mess that tried to conform to the budget reconciliation rules. It should have been a comprehensive measure, and I'm continuing to urge the leadership to pursue that path.
Can you speak to why they haven't?
When you talk to the House Republican leadership, it would be dead on arrival in the Senate. My responses would we be any worse off than it is than we are right now? To the senators, what they will say is, that rule was very helpful when we were in the minority. We were able to block a lot of bad bills. And it's true, you can block a lot of bad bills with that rule. You can also block a lot of good bills, and it's about time Senate Republicans decided whether they want to be a successful majority or they want to go back to being a successful minority, because they cannot be a successful majority with that rule in place. And don't think for a moment that Chuck Schumer and the Democrats, were they to take the majority, wouldn't hesitate a moment to reform that rule.
Fantastic.
Because they already promised to do that when they thought they were going to take a majority of the Senate in 2016.
Yeah. Fantastic insight and way to lay it out, because that really is the concern.
Oh, it's very frustrating. It's particularly frustrating to House members. We have sent more legislation in the first 6 months of our session. We sent more legislation over to the Senate than any House in the last 4 presidential elections, including some very important measures. Among them, a regulatory reform bill, the Choice Act, which rolls back a lot of the Dodd-Frank regulations that are absolutely killing our community banks. All of those have gone over to the Senate, and they've all stopped dead because of the cloture rule.
Isn't that something? That's amazing. Now, and then are we experiencing the similar hang-ups with tax reform? Are there issues there that are a bit different than what's blocking health care getting done?
The House is about to take up tax reform. They're also planning to use budget reconciliation for that. The good news is that budget reconciliation is much more adapted for a tax reform measure than it is for a health care measure. I still think they should move it with a comprehensive package through regular order, but tax reform is absolutely vital. Look, this administration and this Congress have been given 3 overarching mandates by the American people, and number 1 is to revive the economy. Number 2 is to secure the borders. Number 3 is to rescue our health care system. We're still working on number 3. We've made major progress on number 2, securing the borders. I mean, there's been a dramatic reduction in illegal border crossings since the president made it clear that we're going to enforce our immigration laws. But the overarching mandate is to revive our economy, and we've made some progress in that. This president, in the first 100 days, signed more legislation into law than any president since Harry Truman. That was because we passed a lot of Congressional Review Act measures that bypassed the cloture rule in the Senate. Those measures, plus the president's executive orders, have produced about $70 billion of regulatory relief to the American economy. And that doesn't include the president's executive orders, for example, getting the government out of the way on the construction of the Keystone Pipeline and other vital infrastructure that have been held up by the previous administration. And it doesn't include all of the measures that we have sent over to the Senate that the Senate is sitting on because of the cloture rule. And you're beginning to see some signs that the economy is responding. Consumer confidence is way up. Wages are starting to inch up, but we've got a very long way to go. Tax reform is absolutely vital. The president wants to move us toward a broader, flatter, a lower rate tax system. Every country that has moved in that direction has been rewarded with explosive economic growth. Our own country did that back, you remember When Ronald Reagan took office in 1980, we had double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, mile-long lines around gas stations. Interest rates were at 20%. President Reagan, in his inaugural address, announced that he said, in this great economic crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. He rolled back the tax and regulatory burdens that were crushing the economy and produced one of the longest and most profound periods of economic expansion in our nation's history. That same team of economic advisors has produced the Trump administration's tax plan. It's going to be absolutely essential that the Congress pass it and that the president sign it before the end of the year so that it will have the time to work through the economy so that people will feel it in their own daily lives.
Well, on tax reform now, what we're talking about here is essentially amending a current system, right, and making it more efficient. But, for example, conservatives over the last years have kicked ideas around like a flat tax or a fair tax, which would be a consumption tax. Are any principles from those two tax suggestions incorporated?
This moves us toward a much flatter tax system and a much simpler tax system as well. It'll be getting rid of a lot of the deductions and exemptions and loopholes that have so completely distorted the natural flow of capital and done enormous harm to the economy in the meantime. That's one of the critical components of it. The other one is simplifying the tax laws to the point where people can file their tax returns, on a single sheet of paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good.
Actually, on a postcard-sized sheet of paper.
Yeah. So does there look like there's hope for tax reform legislation leaving the House this year?
Yes, I think that's now number one priority for the House. The biggest stumbling block was a proposal called the Border Adjustment Tax. That would have meant major increases to a lot of retail products, the price of them. That's now, and that was the biggest stumbling block. That's been dropped from the proposal, so I think that it's still going to be controversial. I mean, anytime you change any part of the tax code, somebody benefits, somebody loses, and all the people who lose are out there screaming. But in this case, I think that this is going to be an exercise that has to come to fruition. I mean, failure is not an option on any of these three mandates. These were given to us by the American people. Along with their trust, we'd get the job done. And we really need to get the job done this year in order to assure that these reforms have time to take effect.
Now, the border adjustment tax was one of the planks in Trump's, the president's tax reform packages. So is he going to have objection to something like that, or is if this hits it?
Actually, the president was always very cool to the border adjustment tax. So that's the good news there.
Well, very good.
Yeah, and in fact, I think it was part of his leadership that kind of convinced the congressional leadership to drop it.
Okay. Well, now you raised the issue of immigration and our border security, and you said that there have been some successes there. Can you identify some of the reasons that we've had success in seeing illegal border crossings drop?
We're now actively tracking down criminal illegal immigrants, arresting them, and getting them the hell out of this country.
Yeah, fantastic.
And the good news on immigration is that securing our borders does not require new laws. It simply requires the enforcement of existing laws. The president has one fundamental central responsibility under our Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The last several presidents have refused to acknowledge that with respect to their responsibilities on enforcing our immigration law. This president is taking them seriously, and the result is deportations are up, illegal border crossings are way down, border patrol morale is way up, and we are going after those criminal aliens in this country who have no right to be here and present a clear and present danger to the public safety of the American people.
So in all of that effectiveness, with essentially without any additional monetary allocation to it?
Well, actually, in the appropriations bill that the House has just passed, there's major increase to border patrol activities, including $1.6 billion to begin construction of the border wall. But once again, that bill, passed by a majority of the House, goes over to the Senate and comes to a screeching halt once again because the Senate Republicans refuse to reform their cloture rule.
Yeah. Terribly frustrating, I'm sure, especially from your side of the Capitol.
Well, it would be frustrating if this was an act of God that was beyond our control.
Right.
It's infuriating because this is entirely within their control and they choose not to do it.
Yeah. You mentioned infrastructure and spending there, and I know that was a big portion of the president's campaign, something he talked about quite a bit. And for us here in this portion of California and all through the Central Valley, for example, water reservoirs and the management of our water resources is tremendously important. So you've been an advocate of the GROW Act, and perhaps our viewers would like to know a little bit about what the GROW Act is, where you think that's at, and now with Republicans controlling both houses, should that happen?
The GROW Act is actually the latest version of legislation that my subcommittee on Water and Power produced when I chaired that committee for 4 years. And I'll tell you what I learned in those 4 years. Droughts are nature's fault. They happen. But water shortages are our fault. Water shortages are a choice that we made 45 years ago when we stopped building new reservoirs. Nature produces about 45,000 gallons of fresh water every day for every man, woman, and child on this planet. There is no shortage of fresh water. The problem is it is unevenly distributed over both time and distance. We build reservoirs in order to move water from wet years so that we have plenty in dry years. And we build aqueducts to move water from wet areas to dry areas. The problem is we stopped building these facilities a generation ago, and we're now living with the result. Chronic shortages, even in times of normal rainfall. And having come through the last 4 years of drought, 5 years of drought actually, followed by a year of well above normal precipitation, we see exactly what happens. We were within months of major communities running out of water. I mean, totally running out of water to the point where if you turned on your tap, nothing would have come out. Several smaller communities actually did cross that line. Enormous groundwater reductions in the Central Valley as a result of increased pumping trying to make up that difference. We are not going to solve our water problems until we build more reservoirs. And we're not going to build more reservoirs until we overhaul the environmental laws that are making their construction cost prohibitive. The example I like to use is a little town called Forest Hill in Placer County in my district. A little town, about 5,000 population. They get their water from the Sugar Pine Reservoir, small reservoir built years ago with a dam that has an 18-foot spillway, but no spillway gate. Didn't need the extra water at the time, they do now, so the town went out and priced a spillway gate. Comes to about $2 million for the gate, but that's not the price of the project. To the $2 million for the gate, they have to add at least $1 million for environmental reviews, and God knows how many years, another $2 million for environmental mitigations, and on top of that, the Forest Service is giving them a bill of $6 million as the price of moving a single trail that goes around the lake and a half dozen campsites. So a $2 million infrastructure project, it was a heavy lift for this little community, but within reach, becomes this $11 million cost-prohibitive boondoggle. And those same laws that prevented us from completing the Shasta Dam, for example, which, when fully completed, should add another 9 million acre-feet of water storage. That nearly doubles the water storage we have on the Sacramento River system. Just completing that dam. So that's what has to be done. And by the way, it's the same environmental laws that are also making it impossible for us to manage our forests and have produced this monumental overcrowding and now the tree mortality that's followed the overcrowding.
These environmental laws that you're touching on right here, are these federal where the Republicans can do something about it, or how much of this is California causing a problem?
Well, California is its own problem in and of itself,
yeah.
And but the laws I'm referring to are federal laws that have made the management of our forests, the construction of new water projects, cost and time prohibitive.
Okay. Yeah, it's a tremendous, once again, an issue that hopefully we can get solved now that Congress has changed.
Well, that's
hands.
the good news, is that, again, none of this is, some act of God that's been imposed on us that's beyond our control. These are all acts of government. They're all choices that we have made and that we can change anytime we summon the political will to do so. In the last 4 presidential elections, last 4 national elections, I should say, the American people have clearly indicated their desire for change. They've elected a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican President. We've seen a net shift of 64 U.S. House seats, 12 U.S. Senate seats, 10 now 11 governors, 919 state legislative seats, and the White House have all turned on this frustration of the American people. Now they have given us a mandate, and we have to fulfill that mandate. And that, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but that brings us right back to our Senate Republicans and their choice not to reform closure.
Now, here, as you've traveled around your district,
and also might add, the GROW Act, which expedites dam construction, begins to alter these environmental laws so that we can start meeting the water needs of the next generation of Californians and of Americans. That bill has passed the House 3 times in 3 sessions of Congress, most lately just a few months ago. And again, it is sitting in the Senate for lack of action because it can't get 60 votes for closure.
No kidding. So once again, here, a success on the House side, and yet the Senate is the roadblock and the obstacle.
Yeah.
Now, with the GROW Act, I imagine have appropriations been made in the budgetary process that since the House has passed the GROW Act, I mean, it will be funded.
Well, the GROW Act, provides the authorizations. Then that's followed up by an appropriations bill that actually allocates the dollars. But yes, it authorizes expediting the Temperance Flat Dam of the Sites Reservoir. It begins to reform.
Some of these have been on the docket for decades.
Exactly. Oh, yes.
Okay.
I mean, my God, Sites has been studied to death 20 or 30 years now. I have a bill that's also passed the House and is waiting action in the Senate that would streamline the permitting process for new reservoir construction so that one agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, will take charge of any application, will immediately convene all of the different agencies that are responsible for permitting, establish a timetable, and oversee that timetable. There is, instead of this endless delay by one bureaucracy, only to have at the end of that process have another bureaucracy suddenly pop out and claim jurisdiction and start another long process of this bill requires a coordinated effort. The same data is used for the same project by all of the agencies. It's guaranteed to be transparent to the public so the science behind it can be critiqued. These are absolutely essential reforms. All of them passed the House already in this session, and all of them still awaiting action in the Senate.
Phenomenal. Well, Congressman, excuse me, you've got me thinking about the Senate so much.
Well, that is the problem.
Regulatory reform, when we see that our president is attempting to do much on regulatory reform. So I'd like to speak a little bit in our next segment, on our next show, about bureaucracy and regulatory reform and how the House and committees there and how the House might be handling that and dealing with it. So I want to thank you very much for our first show here on Inside View. And to our viewers, we're going to do another segment with the Congressman in just a minute. So stick around and we'll see what he has to say on many other topics. Great. Thank you again, Congressman.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.